Okay, so today I want to talk about something that I think is the most important and the most underestimated aspect of this entire war. And once you understand this, everything else, the bombing, the drones, the missiles, the interceptors, all of that becomes almost secondary. Because here is the thing, Iran has a weapon, and this weapon has not been fully fired yet. And the terrifying thing is, it doesn't need to be fired to win the war. The threat alone is enough to collapse the American empire. Okay? And what is this weapon? It is the Strait of Hormuz. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, I've heard about the Strait of Hormuz before. I've heard people talk about it. What's new? Why is this so important right now? And I want to answer that. But first, I want to take a step back and explain something that I think most people completely miss when they talk about this war. And that is the difference between two types of power, okay? The first type of power is what I call hard power. Hard power is the kind of power you can see. Bombs, missiles, drones, fighter jets, aircraft carriers. This is the power that America has in abundance. And when most people think about this war, they think about hard power. They think about who has the bigger bomb, who has the better missile, who has the more advanced jet. The second type of power is what I call structural power. And structural power is invisible. You cannot see it. It works quietly, it works slowly, but when it is used, when it is fully activated, it is far more devastating than any bomb. Because structural power does not just destroy a building or a military base, it destroys the entire system that the other side depends on to function. And this is the key insight I want to share with you today. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a piece of geography. It is Iran's structural power weapon. And Iran has been sitting on this weapon for decades. And right now, they are using it. Not fully, not yet, but they are using it. And already, it is changing the entire picture of this war, okay? So let me explain what the Strait of Hormuz actually is and why it matters so much. Because I think a lot of people know the name, but don't really understand the numbers. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway. At its narrowest point, it is only 21 miles wide, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean. And through this small, narrow channel, roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass every single day. Let me put that in perspective. That is approximately 20 to 27% of all the world's oil that is traded by sea. 1/5 to 1/4 of all the world's oil supply passes through a 21 mi gap that is bordered on one side by Iran. And it is not just oil. The Strait of Hormuz also carries approximately 20% of all the world's liquefied natural gas, LNG, most of it coming from Qatar. So if you want to heat your home in Europe or in Japan or South Korea, that gas is passing through the Strait of Hormuz. And there is no alternative route. There is no pipeline that can replace it. There is no other channel that can handle that volume. The Strait of Hormuz is the only way. Now, before this war started, about 3,000 ships per month were passing through the strait. Since Iran declared the strait closed to hostile nations in March 2026, that number has dropped to about 5% of what it was. 5%. That means 95% of shipping traffic has stopped. 95%. Okay. So that is the weapon. Now, I want to explain using game theory and structural analysis, why this weapon is so powerful that Iran doesn't even need to fully use it to win. Let me give you a thought experiment, okay? Imagine you are playing chess, and imagine that one of your pieces, let's say your rook, is sitting in the corner and hasn't moved. But just because it is there, sitting in that corner, your opponent cannot move freely on that side of the board. Every move they make, they have to look at that rook, they have to account for it, they have to defend against it, even though it hasn't moved. The Strait of Hormuz is Iran's rook. It is sitting there, and every decision that America makes in this war, every calculation Trump makes, every conversation that happens in the Pentagon, every meeting in the Gulf states, all of it happens in the shadow of that rook. All of it happens with one question in the background. What happens if Iran fully closes the strait? And the answer to that question is what I want to walk you through now. Because this answer explains why I have said from the beginning that America cannot win this war. Okay? Let's talk about oil first. Right now, oil prices are already elevated because of this war. We are already seeing disruption to global energy markets. But what happens if Iran fully closes the strait? What happens if they go beyond the selective closures they are doing now and genuinely shut off all traffic? Larry Fink, who runs BlackRock, the largest asset management company in the world, the company that manages trillions of dollars of global investments, he went on BBC and said, if Iran maintains control of the strait, we could see oil at $150 a barrel for years. Some analysts are saying $200. And what does $200 oil mean? It means economic recession everywhere. Not just in America, in Europe, in China, in Japan, in India, in every country that depends on energy to run its economy, which is every country on earth. Okay, now you might say, well, America has its own oil. America is energy independent now, right? The shale revolution. So why does the Strait of Hormuz matter for America? And this is a really good question. And the answer reveals something important about how the global economy actually works. America does not need Gulf oil for itself. That is true. But here's the thing. The global economy runs on a single price for oil. When oil goes to $200 a barrel in the global market, the price of gasoline in America goes up too. The price of food in America goes up because food production requires energy. The price of everything goes up. You cannot separate the American consumer from the global oil price. It does not work that way. And more importantly, and this is the key point, the American economy is not really an industrial economy anymore. It is a financial economy. America's power in the world today rests on one thing above all else, the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. And the US dollar as the reserve currency rests on one thing, the petrodollar system. So let me explain what the petrodollar system is and why the Strait of Hormuz threatens it directly. Okay? This is really important. After World War II, America and Saudi Arabia made a deal. The deal was simple. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil only in US dollars. In exchange, America would protect the Saudi regime militarily. Because Saudi Arabia sells oil in dollars, every country in the world that needs oil, which is every country, needs dollars to buy that oil. This creates permanent global demand for the US dollar. And this permanent global demand means America can print more money than any other country, run bigger deficits than any other country, and still have the world accept its currency. It means America can borrow cheaply. It means America can finance its military, which, as we discussed, is 41% of global military spending without its economy collapsing. The petrodollar is the financial foundation of American power. Now, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, they collect all these petrodollars from selling oil. And what do they do with them? They recycle them back into the American economy. They invest in American stocks, American bonds, American real estate, American technology companies, American AI data centers. In fact, right now, the entire AI boom, the thing that is driving the American stock market, is being financed significantly by Gulf state petrodollar investment. So here is the chain. Iran threatens the Strait of Hormuz. The strait disruption threatens Gulf state oil exports. Gulf state oil export disruption threatens petrodollar recycling. Petrodollar recycling disruption threatens the AI bubble. The AI bubble bursting threatens the entire American stock market. The American stock market collapse creates economic recession and political crisis inside America. This is the weapon. This is how Iran wins without firing. Not by bombing Washington, not by sending troops to California, but by pulling on one thread of the global financial system until the entire sweater unravels. And we are already seeing this happen. We already saw what happened to the markets when there was even uncertainty about the strait. Imagine what happens when the disruption becomes permanent, okay? Now, I want to go deeper because the Strait of Hormuz is not just one weapon. It is actually 3 weapons in one. And I want to walk through each one. The first weapon is oil. We have already discussed this, but let me add one more dimension. The GCC countries get 90% of their food through the Strait of Hormuz. Think about that. 90% of food. These are desert countries. They do not grow food. They import almost everything. And the ships that bring that food pass through the strait. So Iran is not just threatening to cut off the oil supply of the GCC. Iran is threatening the food supply of the GCC. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, their populations could face food shortages if this continues long enough. The second weapon is water. Okay, this one most people do not think about at all, and I think it is actually the most powerful. The GCC countries are desert countries. They have almost no natural fresh water. Where does their water come from? It comes from desalination plants, huge industrial facilities that take seawater and turn it into fresh water. And these plants provide 60% of the GCC's water supply. A city like Riyadh, 10 million people, gets most of its water from these plants. Now, here's the terrifying thing. These desalination plants are on the coast. They are large, stationary, above-ground targets, and Iran has drones, $50,000 drones. If Iran decides to hit the desalination plants of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which it can do, those cities run out of water in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. A city of 10 million people with no water. Think about what that means. Think about the panic. Think about the immediate political collapse of any government facing that scenario. This is why I have said that Iran is not just threatening the GCC's economy. Iran is threatening the very existence of these nations. And these nations know it. This is why the GCC is terrified. This is why even Saudi Arabia and UAE, who wanted regime change in Iran, are now extremely nervous about escalation because they know that Iran can make their countries unlivable. The third weapon is the AI economy. We just discussed this, the petrodollar recycling chain that finances the AI bubble. But let me add one more data point. Amazon had a data center in the UAE that was hit during this war. Big technology companies, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, were all looking at the Gulf as the next major hub for AI infrastructure because of cheap and abundant energy. That is now in serious question. The energy is no longer cheap, it is no longer certain, and the big tech companies are now rethinking those investments, which means the Gulf's plan to transform itself into an AI economy, which was the plan to survive the post-oil era, is collapsing at exactly the moment it was supposed to begin. Okay? So now I want to bring this back to the strategic level because I want to use game theory to explain why this weapon is so difficult for America to counter. When most people think about how to respond to the Strait of Hormuz threat, they say, well, America has the most powerful navy in the world. Can't America just force the strait open? Can't America just escort ships through? Can't America just destroy Iran's missiles and drones on the shore? And the answer is, it is not that simple. Let me explain why. Iran's missile bases and drone launch sites are not sitting on the beach. They are spread across hundreds of kilometers of territory. They are inside mountains. They are underground. They are in the Zagros mountain range, in the Alborz Mountains, deep inside Iranian territory. We know this because after weeks of American bombing, with the most advanced air force in the world, Iran's missile and drone capabilities are still fully operational. If anything, they are increasing in effectiveness. So the idea that America can bomb its way to an open strait is not supported by the evidence. And even if America somehow managed to neutralize those sites, even if America somehow opened the strait militarily, what happens then? Iran still has the ability to destroy the oil facilities of the GCC. It still has the ability to hit the desalination plants. It still has the ability to hit the data centers. The problem is not just a narrow channel of water. The problem is the entire geography of vulnerability around it. And there is one more dimension that I think is absolutely crucial. And this is the insurance problem. Even if the strait is technically open, even if ships are allowed to pass, who is going to insure those ships? Ship insurance is calculated on risk. If there is a reasonable probability that your $100 million tanker is going to be hit by a missile or a drone while transiting the strait, your insurance premium becomes astronomical. Your bank will not finance a cargo. Your shipping company will not take the risk. So even a technically open strait becomes a practically closed strait if the threat remains credible. And the threat will remain credible as long as Iran has the capability and the will to act, which it does. This is why I said at the beginning of this lecture that the threat alone is enough. Iran does not need to fire every missile. It does not need to close the strait completely every day. It just needs to maintain a credible threat. And it is doing that, and it will continue to do that. Okay, now let me connect all of this to the broader strategic picture that I have been building in this series of lectures. I have argued that war is fought across 4 dimensions: military, economic, political, and narrative. And I have argued that America is trying to make the economic, political, and narrative dimensions conform to its military strategy, while Iran is using the military to shape the economic, political, and narrative dimensions. The Strait of Hormuz is often presented as a simple geographic choke point, but in strategic terms, it functions as a pressure valve for the global economy. The argument being made here is that the United States is approaching Iran through conventional military logic: apply force, escalate pressure, force submission, while Iran is operating on an entirely different strategic layer. Instead of trying to match American military power directly, Iran is allegedly leveraging the limited but extremely high-impact leverage it has over this narrow maritime corridor to generate disproportionate economic and political consequences. In this framework, the Strait of Hormuz becomes less about naval control and more about systemic influence. Even partial disruption or uncertainty in the flow of shipping is enough to affect global oil prices, insurance costs, supply chains, and market stability. Each incremental increase in economic pressure compounds over time. As energy prices rise and global markets react, domestic political costs in the United States also increase, especially in terms of public support for prolonged military engagement. The strategic idea being described here is not battlefield victory, but the gradual erosion of political will under economic strain. This logic is often compared to asymmetric warfare in historical conflicts. Vietnam is frequently cited as an example where a technologically superior power failed not because of military defeat in the traditional sense, but because the long-term political, economic, and social costs of the war became unsustainable domestically. The parallel being drawn is that modern conflicts involving major powers may be decided less by battlefield outcomes and more by which side can sustain political endurance under pressure. In this interpretation, Iran's strategy is not to defeat the United States militarily, but to increase the long-term cost of engagement until continued escalation becomes politically unviable. A key element of this strategy, as described, is controlled escalation rather than total disruption. If Iran were to fully close the Strait of Hormuz, it would risk unifying a broad coalition of global actors against it, including major trading partners that depend on uninterrupted energy flows. Instead, maintaining a calibrated level of uncertainty allows Iran to preserve leverage while avoiding complete isolation. This selective pressure creates a situation where some actors continue to benefit from limited access, while others perceive risk and instability, reinforcing divisions in how different global powers interpret responsibility for the disruption. From this perspective, the Strait of Hormuz is not just an energy corridor, but also a diplomatic instrument. It can influence alignment among global powers by shaping perceptions of who is responsible for instability in international markets. Countries dependent on energy imports may prioritize stability over political alignment, while exporters and intermediaries may adjust their positions based on economic exposure. The result is a shifting landscape of incentives, where economic dependence becomes a form of strategic leverage. The broader claim being made is that this dynamic extends beyond oil markets into the architecture of global finance itself. Because oil is largely traded in dollars, disruptions in energy flows can reverberate through currency systems, sovereign reserves, and financial markets. In this interpretation, sustained instability in a critical energy corridor indirectly pressures the mechanisms that reinforce U.S. financial dominance, including capital recycling from energy exporting regions back into Western markets. Within this framework, the Strait of Hormuz becomes a multi-layered strategic tool. First, it can influence global oil prices and create inflationary pressure. Second, it can affect the stability of Gulf states that rely heavily on uninterrupted maritime trade and energy exports. Third, it can indirectly stress financial systems tied to energy recycling and global liquidity flows. Importantly, none of these outcomes require full closure of the strait. The mere perception of risk or limited disruption can be sufficient to trigger systemic effects. The conclusion drawn from this analysis is that the conflict is not primarily being fought in military terms, but in terms of endurance, perception, and economic pressure. One side is assumed to be operating on a model of direct force and escalation, while the other is described as operating on delayed pressure, strategic ambiguity, and structural constraints. In such a scenario, the decisive factor is not immediate battlefield success, but which system can sustain internal political cohesion under prolonged economic and strategic stress. Ultimately, this interpretation frames the Strait of Hormuz not as a localized maritime issue, but as a node in a much larger system, connecting energy markets, global finance, military strategy, and political stability. Whether or not one agrees with the conclusions, the central idea is that modern power struggles increasingly operate through interconnected economic systems where geography, trade routes, and financial flows can have strategic effects comparable to traditional military force.